What is commodification to you?
When I think about the word commodification, I think about the attribution of some value, some kind of economic value to something, and I think about production, and I think about reproduction. I think about something being transformed in this context sometimes from what might have been a different context, I guess, into an economic context. So the idea of something that was once danced being something once sold, that idea. So I think of that as commodification, attributing some kind of economic value, getting it out into the marketplace. I think of the marketplace when I think of commodification.
How does that word morality fit into the discussions that we've been hearing about commodification?
I think actually there were a couple of things that came out that were really striking to me over the last couple of days. One was a statement in Rosemary's paper about protection from commodification and protection through commodification. Many of us work in an area of trying to protect something from commodification. So we're trying to prevent certain secret knowledge from being used, or we're trying to ensure that an item that has some kind of spiritual force is used in an appropriate way, that the responsibilities around knowledge and objects are respected, right? So a lot of us are talking about protection in many ways, but protecting through commodification is also another interesting concept, which is the idea of making sure images are used properly by being engaged in how they're being used, right? Mm-hmm. So there's certain things that it's okay to commodify or to appropriate within a particular Indigenous culture and put it out there. Certain masks are intended to be carved, and dance, certain masks are intended to be carved and sold. That idea, right? Mm-hmm. So there's protection through commodification. When I think about that concept, and I'll come to morality in a minute. When I think about this idea of protection through commodification, it generates ways to, I think, bring economic strength into a community, to ensure, as I said before, things are used properly, responsibilities are being carried out in relation to items, lands, information, whatever we want to categorize it as, where it's appropriate to do so. So how does morality fit into that? And how does morality fit into stuff that is out there being commodified, in which Indigenous peoples have no participation, and to which some of those things I talked about apply? They need to be used in a particular way, or an image is a sacred image, so it should not be put in a particular place. You know, it shouldn't be, for example, hung in a restroom or something like that. That would be considered disrespectful, right? So morality enters in because there's not a heck of a lot the law can do with some stuff that's out there already, right? Right now, the way the law works is we can take preventative action with respect to the future. But with respect to stuff that's already out there on a coffee mug, or already out there as a totem pole in front of a liquor store, or wherever it is, some of the examples that we were talking about, what we have to do is create a moral imperative. And that's the other phrase that came out over the last couple of days that was very powerful for me. Because in this area over the last 25 years, we have to, and we have learned how to work in the spaces in between. Because the law will only get us so far. So it's those spaces in between and ethics that can really help us deal with some of these issues where the law can't. Business people have ethics. Professional people have ethics. So we can appeal to those ethical norms and talk to them about the impact of commodification, where items come from, how this might affect a community. People may respond, right? So I do think, I'm not saying they're going to for sure, but we heard some great examples of how they did. So thinking about ethics around this, why it's important for Indigenous peoples to participate in a way that those who are purchasing can understand, right? In the way that the market economy can understand, in the way that the individual art collector, of which I'm one, can understand, is, I think, highly important, and to me probably the most important thing that will come out of this meeting. I think what we should be thinking about are appealing to ethics of non-Indigenous players, and seeing how we can empower Indigenous law, Indigenous, what some people call protocols, through ethics, through appealing to business ethics, through appealing to this moral imperative and creating this moral imperative.
What kind of strategies do you think would need to be employed to kind of change that public consciousness about the moral imperative?
That's where we have to start bringing together a lot of our collective knowledges and experiences, right? Like my experience, although somewhat diverse, doesn't take me into things like marketing. And I think those are some of the kinds of people we need to talk to. You know, like how do we communicate those kinds of messages in a way that's effective? There are people who specialize in those things, and we should be talking to them about those kinds of questions. But I also think there's the element of respect and reciprocity, and I think more invitations, more openness for non-Indigenous peoples to be coming into Indigenous communities. Cultural tourism actually, I think, has a lot of opportunity for this if it's handled properly, because the more engagement that people have with First Nation, Inuit, or Métis communities, the more understanding that we're going to create, right? So part of it is not having these isolated worlds. In terms of specific strategies, I think it would be very helpful for us to create something like a question answer on, if you want to engage in ethical, exchange with Indigenous peoples, what are some of the questions you should ask, right? Because there are people out there who actually do care. And so at least to have some kind of guideline. And then the other, I think, partly, I mean, again, I'm not a marketer, but one can start targeting some of the big producers and marketers, and some of the smaller ones, maybe start small. You know, we had the very good example the other day of someone speaking to a descendant of Mungo Martin, speaking to a liquor store owner who, once they understood about the inappropriate use, was quite happy to take them down. So I think we have to, I like to be optimistic. I like to be optimistic, even though it's very hard working in this field, because we make advances and then they get taken away, and we have to work in the spaces in between, and then we make advances, right? And I mean in law, and then it gets taken away, and then we have to work in between. So it does get frustrating, but at the same time I hear those kinds of stories, and I think in this area that's part of the answer. A lot of people have talked about law reform. A lot of people have talked about we need laws to prevent this from happening. And as I mentioned before, if we're talking about stuff that's already out there, it's extremely difficult. If we're talking about ideas, information, traditions currently within the control of the community, there's stuff we can do. And it's an entirely different approach. We can do things like we talked about before, protocols, right? Traditional knowledge protocols and guidelines around what's released and what isn't before it even gets out of the community, right? But once it's already out there, that's an entirely different story. I'm not saying abandon law reform, and in fact there's a number of people still working on it, including myself. But there are other options, again, that we can explore. I'm fascinated by, I believe it's Australia, it's been a while since I've looked at this, but I'm fascinated by this idea of some kind of a commission where a percentage of every sale goes into a pot that artists can then access, which essentially recognizes the impact of colonization on arts, the artists, how images, I don't really like using the word art because, it's what's art, what's artifact, what's ethnographic, but using the word art for lack of a better term.
This provocative idea that Rosemary Coombe raised in her paper, protection through commodification.
Okay, well I have an example of that. The typical example of that is the petroglyph, right? That was protected by the Nanaimo First Nation. They were able to figure out a way under the Trademark Act to qualify as a public authority certain petroglyphs they felt were being used inappropriately. They were being put onto jewelry, t-shirts, that sort of thing for the Dancing Man Music Festival. And the Nanaimo First Nation objected to this, so they actually were able to trademark that image. But to trademark it, you have to keep it out in the public. So it's on their letterhead, and it's on cards and things like that. That works, as long as it's okay for the image to be in the public. That enables that prevents others from using it from what were inappropriate uses that weren't connected to the particular First Nation that asserted ownership over that image. And so they were able to utilize it, but only because their value system was consistent with what the law required to be done for them to use it, to protect. If you can fit, but the problem is that there's very few circumstances within which, I mean, we can mobilize intellectual property tools like that, but those tools are still requiring us to manipulate Indigenous laws, values, and understandings in order to use them. You know,
like,
for me,
do you mean like a cross-cultural translation?
I mean like colonization of thought. I mean that over time, as people are trying to fit into these different categories, one understanding is replaced with another. And this is why people have called for what we call sui generis or unique legislation, because when we think about commodification, this particular workshop is focused on intangible heritage, but having said that, those of us who work in intangible heritage understand intangible isn't intangible necessarily in an Indigenous context. It's land, it's object, it's idea, it's information, it all comes together in one place, right? The law doesn't work that way. It divides all those things up. So trying to find a way to protect through laws that already allow commodification is very difficult. Another example of law that commodifies, although it's supposed to be designed to protect, in Canada is the Cultural Property Export and Import Act. And that legislation, what it does is it prevents items that are considered to be of national significance from being sold outside of Canada without first an opportunity for a designated institution to purchase it and keep it within Canada. So if it's identified as having some great Canadian value, there might be a 6-month stop order put on it, and we look to see if there's somebody in Canada who can buy it, okay? There's not even an Indigenous person on the board. There's no requirement to consult with Indigenous communities, even if the item is 150 years old and originated from their community, okay? They hear about it through a nice museum like the Museum of Anthropology. If it happens to come across somebody's desk, they go, oh boy, that's so-and-so's rattle. That's used for that. That's not something that should be marketed. And then they contact the First Nation, right? So the law has serious problems in terms of preventing commodification, because property law is about commodification, right? So you can use the trademark to protect, but there's no way. It's very hard to use the Cultural Property Export and Import Act to protect. Well, that's not true unless you partner. There are some examples of partnering with museums where they've been able to utilize that legislation. So, okay, there's an example. What did we do? A mask that was stopped. Royal British Columbia Museum and a bunch of other partners partnered with the New Hulk. They were able to get repatriation funding. The mask was brought back home. Right? That's great. But it's now governed according to principles that museums use. Not 100%, right? But it's, so this whole system, the Cultural Property Export and Import Act, is, they say it's about protecting cultural property, but it's actually about commodifying it. It's about what you have to do to get it into the market, right? And that whole process doesn't even anticipate source communities when it comes to Indigenous art, except for some of the actors in that, like our wonderful museums, right? The Museum of Anthropology, the Museum of British Columbia, the Museum of Civilization, those folks, when they're hearing about it, because the people who are notified have to be designated institutions. So there's ways to utilize that kind of legislation, right? I'm rambling a bit here, but so there's there's commodification legislation out there that we can use to help protect. So we brought the mask home, protected it, it's where it's supposed to be, the community can have access to it again. We got the trademark of the petroglyph on the paper, nobody else can use it. right? But that's working in the spaces in between. That's what I'm talking about. And that's not reflecting Indigenous values. That's Indigenous peoples having to fit and squeeze their needs into this system that is based on getting everything out there. The more the merrier, you know. The idea is the more that share the resources, the better off society is, right? That's the Western philosophy around our relationship to property.
How can you protect something through commodification that's already in the public domain?
Once things are in the public domain, it's very difficult. That's where our moral imperative is really important. That's where our education, our, is it really ethical, in your business, if you say that you are doing fair trade, to put on an image from an Indigenous nation that considers it sacred, right? Mm-hmm. I bet you if you went to a business that says that they're ethical and do fair trade, they take that image off. If you talked about it the right way and if you appealed to their ethical code of conduct. So somebody made that very good point. There are businesses out there that have ethical codes of conduct. Let's start with them. Make a splash, make it public. That's an interesting idea. Like I say, I'm not a marketer, but I find that very, very appealing, and I'm going to think about that.